also points to the band's early decision to record in other languages as key to building an international fan base. It's a bizarrely boring nuts and bolts explanation coming from him. Of course, what he says is true, but there's obviously more to it than that. If you ask me, part of Pink Martini's secret is that they've fully embraced what makes them different from everyone else. And in so doing, they've nestled into a spot that is authentically and singularly theirs, without ever chasing a trend or a fad. That is to say, even if you're the most talented singer-songwriter with a guitar in the world, hundreds of other talented guitar-playing singer-songwriters are coming up right behind you, breathing down your neck. And there's not really anybody else competing to be the UN's house band from 1962, as Thomas describes Pink Martini's style. They are enthusiastically, unapologetically themselves. And I think another secret is that Thomas has never stopped evolving. At most concerts, you'll still hear songs that I was dancing to back when I was in high school. But anytime things began to feel stale, Thomas pivoted and branched out in new directions, whether the rest of the band liked it or not. He pulled in collaborators across generations and continents, people like the Von Trapps, Phyllis Diller, and even after more than a decade of touring the world with them, it still feels surreal to say this. People like me. When I walk onto the grounds of the Hollywood Bowl these days, it no longer feels like an imposing fortress. Performing there still feels like a wildly outrageous gift, but it doesn't turn me into a crazy dog. One thing that has not changed is the feeling I get walking to center stage as the roar of the crowd rushes in. Every time it washes over me, I feel caught up in a powerful ocean swell, lifting me off the sand in those final seconds before I plant my feet and start to sing. Chapter 5. The Bubble. The first day I set foot in the West Wing, in May 2010, I accidentally walked into the Oval Office while President Barack Obama and Vice President Joe Biden were in there. To state the obvious, that's not supposed to happen. They were meeting with congressional leaders to talk about a Supreme Court vacancy. The event was, in the jargon of the White House press corps, pool only. The press pool is a small rotating group of journalists who represent the entire press corps at events that can't accommodate a crowd. The pool has spots for a print reporter, radio journalist, still photographer, videographer, and so on. On my first day at the White House, I was not the radio reporter in the pool. A few minutes before the event was scheduled to begin, I saw a cluster of journalists gathering at the briefing room's exit door. I assumed that they were headed out to the driveway to watch the congressional leaders arrive. Maybe a lawmaker would toss us a quote on their way in to see the president. That wasn't a totally unreasonable assumption, but you might think that as the new guy, I would have asked a more experienced journalist what the huddle was about. I didn't. I was intimidated. It was my first day, and so I clammed up. I would eventually learn that the White House press corps is a very supportive group, and that they would have been happy to steer me in the right direction if I had bothered to ask. But on that day, all I saw was a bunch of more experienced people who knew more than I did and might judge me for admitting my ignorance. So I joined them and stood there, waiting for whatever happened next. The pool operates on good faith, the assumption being that folks covering the White House know what they're doing and won't try to take advantage of the system. So there was no roll call or head count that day. Our knot of journalists started to move. And as we wound through hallways, heading away from the driveway, I understood that I had made a mistake. The full extent of it hit me only when we walked through the doorway into the room where Obama and Biden were sitting. At that point, I couldn't exactly peel off from the crowd and retrace my steps back to the briefing room. Once again, I clammed up, hoping Secret Service wouldn't clock me and forcibly remove me from the premises. I had seen variations of this tableau a million times on TV, but I never imagined that I might accidentally stumble into it. Obama's White House photographer, Pete Souza, took a photo of the meeting. It shows the leaders of the country perched on couches, hands folded in their laps. Flowers and lamps anchor the side tables, and big boom microphones on telescoping poles stretch across the central coffee table toward the president. Behind the elected leaders, a Greek chorus of journalists hunches over notebooks, microphones, and cameras, intently focused on capturing Obama's every word and gesture. In the photo, you can see my face popping out from the back of the cluster, taller than most of my colleagues, like a meerkat who wandered off the savannah into the Oval Office. In my early teens, I used to have dreams where I showed up to school and discovered that I was a few heads shorter than everybody else. I would strain to make out my friends' conversations, desperate to participate but unable to engage. In the dream, it took me mere seconds to sprout up like a cornstalk, growing too fast until I towered above everyone, now struggling to join in the social scrum from the opposite direction. It doesn't take a psychoanalyst to figure out the symbolism here, embodying every teenager's anxieties about fitting in, and even more so the queer ones. When I look at the photo Pete Souza snapped of my first day on the White House beat, I see the image from my dream transplanted into real life, in a room that represents the global center of political power. It's not that I had imposter syndrome exactly. In fact, I was pretty sure I could check the boxes required of a White House correspondent. By the time I joined the beat, I had covered the Department of Justice for 5 years. I had spent months leading NPR's investigation into U.S. abuse of detainees at Iraq's Abu Ghraib prison, and chronicled post-9/11 debates over torture, spying, and indefinite detention at Guantanamo Bay. Reporting on justice trained me to cover politics and to quickly crank out stories about major news events from Senate hearings to court cases. On paper, moving my focus a few blocks up Pennsylvania Avenue to cover the White House was a logical next step. NPR had actually offered me the White House job a year earlier. I declined it that first time. I was afraid that I would wind up a stenographer to power, parroting what the president said and did each day without adding much value. I wanted to report stories that people would remember, and I had a hard time recalling any story about the White House that had moved me. Also, the prospect of PAC journalism made me wince. Besides, I reasoned, Nina Totenberg had basically spent her entire career covering the Supreme Court. Why couldn't I do the same with the Justice Department? I pictured myself playing reporter Mad Libs on the White House beat, writing stories so familiar that you could draft them before a news event even happened, and then fill in the blanks with the details. I imagined having copy-paste shortcuts for lines like, "The proposed legislation angers Republicans who argue that it amounts to reckless spending," or, "Activists say the president is violating his campaign promise to prioritize their agenda." It hardly even mattered what the proposed legislation or campaign promise might have been. We all know these stories, and I doubted that I could find a more compelling way to tell them. My concerns weren't totally off base, but I can also see now that I was being a bit precious about it. A hurdle for anyone covering the White House is figuring out how to find original stories or how to tell familiar stories in an interesting way. That doesn't have to be a trap. It can be an exciting challenge. And by 2010, with some gentle nudging from my bosses, I decided I was up for it. I figured it would be an education. I'd undoubtedly have some memorable experiences along the way, and having a front row seat to power would help me understand more deeply how our political system works, or doesn't. If it turned out not to be a perfect fit, it wouldn't be forever. When I arrived at the White House on my bicycle for work that first morning, Secret Service agents told me there was nowhere within a couple of blocks of the complex that I was allowed to lock it. The benches and lampposts in Lafayette Square were off limits. I rolled away from my new workplace in search of a bike rack with a sinking feeling that maybe I'd made the wrong choice. As the photograph in the Oval Office later that day would capture, I felt a bit like Cinderella's stepsister trying to force an ill-fitting shoe onto my misshapen foot. Journalists who cover Washington often treat politics as a sport. Political junkies follow budget debates with the same fervor that others dedicate to their fantasy football leagues. To be honest, I'm not totally sure how fantasy football works, but I think the analogy holds. This city is full of people who will confess that they were weirdo kids who spent Sunday mornings with Cocoa Puffs watching This Week and Face the Nation instead of cartoons. Even when I covered the White House, I resisted spending my Sunday mornings that way. When I pick up or click on the newspaper, political stories aren't the first articles I read. I don't yearn to know who's next in line for a powerful committee chairmanship in Congress. Instead, I gravitate toward investigative reports, profiles, and articles that illuminate the entire world by zooming in on a tiny sliver of life. In my reporting and in my news consumption, I'd rather talk to people than about people. Focus on the folks affected by legislation rather than the ones writing it. Entire media empires have been built on the opposite approach, analyzing who's up or down and speculating on how the war in Syria or Yemen will determine which party controls Congress. I have learned how to speak that language, more fluently than I can speak the language of sports anyway, but even after years immersed in Washington, it still feels slightly foreign in my mouth. It took me a few weeks on the new beat to learn that I could lean on other members of the White House press corps for help with translation. The lesson really sank in on my first trip with the president outside Washington.